Welcome to Systems for Success. Many people think success is something that just happens to you if you're lucky or work hard enough. We believe that behind every success is a system in action. My name is Lonnie Ginger. Thanks for joining me and my family as we share real-life stories and learnings that might just help you design the life of your dreams. Tim and Michelle, thank you for being willing to share what you're learning as you've been navigating family business dynamics in a way that ultimately brings deeper meaning and even some good joy in your journey. So for those of you who don't know this amazing couple we're about to talk with, I'll give you just a brief summary of their background and then let them share more detail on their story. Tim worked up through the ranks of private investment firm that his father started and eventually became president of CNL Financial Group. When I first started doing business with CNL in the late 2000s, I think it was one of the largest privately held real estate investment and development companies in the country with back then over 20 billion in assets. And it's grown to be much larger since then. So substantial family enterprise that Tim and Michelle were part of. And in recent years, Tim transitioned to serve in the nonprofit philanthropic space as president of NCF Orlando, where he's helped to catalyze over $200 million of charitable giving from local families, while also launching several other generosity-related ventures. So very full leadership life that Tim is still leading here. And Michelle is a very busy mother, coordinating the training and travels and many activities of their five children, plus being involved in various aspects of Tim's business and investment world. Michelle has her master's in education, and I think she gets an extra gold star for homeschooling some of their kids well before COVID. And she's also developing some really cool initiatives that provide dignified prenatal care to Black mothers in Orlando. So after that brief summary of a very full life, Tim and Michelle, we're looking forward to hearing more about your story and some of the lessons that you've learned along the way. So maybe start with Michelle, since I mentioned your 5 kids. Why don't you begin by telling us a bit about your family, and we'll step back to earlier in your story together.
Hello, thank you, Lonnie. Yes, we have 5 children. Our oldest is 19, a freshman at Wheaton in Chicago, and our youngest is 9. 2 big boys, 3 little girls, and that certainly keeps me busy. It's my dream job. Honestly, it's what I've looked forward to, and I know that our time is limited with those guys, so I just kind of eat it up. I like to think of myself as a hands-on mom, from doing homework, which we were doing last night, till all hours. But my biggest job, I feel like, is to connect with their hearts, and I really work to that end on a daily basis. Which means I'm always tired, but it's good tired.
Oh, that's great. So Michelle, maybe let's step back a bit earlier in your life. Can you tell us just a bit about what your family was like as you were growing up and how you and Tim ended up together?
So I grew up in Texas. My dad worked for the oil refineries in Houston and had several extra jobs after work and on the weekends. My mom was a teacher. I would characterize myself as a feisty but compliant child throughout my growing up years. Tim and I met at Wheaton in Chicago our sophomore year and married as soon as we graduated. And the rest is history.
We waited a whole month to get married after college.
Oh, that's great. So Tim, tell us a bit about the early years of your life and how you ended up working in the family business.
Sure. Well, thanks. I just want to say thanks to Gary and Lonnie. We appreciate the opportunity to be on today. We recognize that there's a lot of folks that have stories, and we're honored to be doing that. And we want to approach that in a humble posture. We're here to share a story, and hopefully there's some things in that are helpful in everybody's journey here on the call today. So thanks for that. I'm a Florida boy, born and raised here. I grew up in the house of an entrepreneur. So my dad started a business the year I was born in 1973. So I was working in the mailroom when I was a teenager, just in and around the business. My mom, we call the Queen of Hospitality. So we were just in my life growing up through college, always hosting, entertaining, convening folks at the house, which was really fun. We started a church in our house. We recruited, talent to come work in the business at the house. We had school events. So it was just a fun growing up time. And mom really made that special on the hospitality side. Neither of my parents come from wealth. So I remember seeing pictures of the first 3 years of my life. My mom had a bike. So I would go on the back of a bike, and it was just very simple. They say 50%. My dad was always firm on the fact that compounding was the 8th wonder of the world. So pretty blue collar growing up years, but enjoyed it, learned a lot. The first liquidity event for our business, we're a private holding company, but we took a company public when I was a freshman in college. So it really didn't start to hit for us until I was gone, but grew up in that environment. We had the opportunity, Michelle said we got married young. We were 21. I just celebrated 25 years, which is crazy to think. Really special this year for us for that. And we had the opportunity to do grad school, and then we were in the UK doing some further study. And that's really where I was thinking about whether I joined the family business or not, and thought through that quite a bit. And just felt like all my summers working there, it was a good group of people. I think we had about 80 or 90 people at that point working in the firm. So I decided to join the family business full time after we had finished 3 years of kind of post undergrad work. Worked hard, loved it. I was on the road pretty early on because I gravitated to the sales management side of the business and learned a ton, right? So I was able to be part of certain committees, just learned to see how people made decisions. So it was great. And honestly, it was really up and to the right from those early days. I started, I guess I was 24, and just had an incredible run in there. We started our family office in 2005. So we were starting to think through some of the issues you all talk here at Family Meridian about. So those were just really formative years, enjoyed the time. And we're going to come back to the second part of my story, but that's a bit of my background up until, say, my mid-30s.
Okay. So, Michelle, can you describe a point where wealth and being married into a significant family business started to feel maybe complicated for you or challenging in any way?
Sure. Where to begin? Like Tim said, wealth was not a part of the start of our story. Like, I had no idea that his family was in business, that money was even really a possibility. For example, he drove what we called the love wagon when we were students at Wheaton, which was his mom's old station wagon with wood paneling and holes in the floors. And we could fit about 12 people in there on those trips downtown. If that's an example of, if that's any indication of what I anticipated life would be like.
You didn't marry him for his money.
That's exactly right. I married him for his money. Then, early in marriage, first couple babies, he was gone a lot, traveled a lot. We sort of structured our lives around the rhythm of him traveling. And it wasn't long before I started to feel the strain between us and his siblings, just the competition, just the strain of him being in the business, us being sort of in Orlando among the community here.
And I'm the oldest of 5, I didn't say, so 4 younger siblings, none of which had an interest in the family business, but that was a dynamic.
Nonetheless, it created tension. And no small part of that tension was that I, much like I prefer not to be part of this interview today, I preferred not to be a part of the spotlight that being a part of the family business put on me and on our family and on our children. So I just felt like that, whereas other siblings would have been much better suited for that role. And so I feel like that created some tension amongst the family. But I would say probably the most important complicating factor for us as a couple was that the comfort and the wealth that was created for us as a couple during those early years of our marriage insulated us and distracted us from seeing ourselves accurately and from working on our marriage in meaningful ways. So I feel like for us as a couple, the pace of life, the notoriety, the ease of life financially created an environment where we were able to put blinders on and avoid the hard between us and within ourselves as individuals.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. It seemed to me that wealth lubricated our existence to some degree, which prohibited us from going deep in some ways. In terms of like, if you were on a calendar, you're just kind of all over the world doing stuff, deals, holidays. There's just a lot. And we were so busy and it was so stimulating. We didn't maybe sit back. And we'll talk a bit about this later, but I think sometimes when you're in a family business and you're in the hometown of the family business, having good boundaries around family of origin, whether it be her family in Texas or my family in Florida, like we didn't do a good job of creating our own thing in those early years, which is something I regret, but it happened. So we're learning from that.
Wow. Michelle, would you mind just taking us back to that point and describe how that affected your marriage?
The early sort of go-go years.
Yeah, when your life was being just lubricated by the wealth and the go-go, and you didn't take the time to really work on your relationship. How did that impact your home life?
Significantly. I mean, not only was Tim going and doing and in meetings and out of town, but we had small children starting 4 years into our marriage, and so I was sleep deprived and very busy and occupied with children. And so really our lives diverged at that point. Our marriage just wasn't, in theory, it was our top priority, but in practical terms, it was not. And so I feel like we created some habits of living life sort of out of touch with ourselves. Michelle was out of touch with Michelle, Tim was out of touch with Tim, and Michelle and Tim were out of touch with each other because we just didn't have the emotional energy, we didn't have the physical energy, we didn't have the time to engage with each other. And life went by fast. There wasn't really time.
It was fun and shallow.
Yes.
Yeah. Go and
exhausting.
Not a lot of reflection, right?
Sure, there are many of us, including myself, who can relate to that. Points in our lives where we get so busy with the pursuit of building whatever we're passionate about in our business life that we lose touch with the most important valuables in our life, which is our relationships. So thanks for sharing that. And I know that was a challenging time for you, but there was then, I think, somewhat of a confluence of events, particularly in your life, Tim, right, that reshaped your life focus or started to reshape it and made you start thinking about life beyond your identity and participation in the family business. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll just piggyback off where Michelle left off, where we were in these go-go years and we were learning. I was learning a lot in the business. I was enjoying what I was doing, but God in some ways uses a crisis for a purpose. So when I was 35, I had a health crisis, and we were a global business at that point, increasingly doing deals around the world, 550 employees. So we'd really grown. I was the president of the company, as you mentioned, by then. We had an executive committee. I mean, things were really rolling. But I had this health scare. I ended up being at MD Anderson in Houston. It turns out that I had a clean bill, but it scared me, right? I remember Maria, our fourth child, was 2 weeks old when I was at the hospital. They took half my liver, not to go into details, but your liver grows back, which I didn't know that. So I have a clean bill, but it really made me reflect. And I actually pulled something from my journal this morning. I was recovering at my parents' farm in Asheville, North Carolina from that surgery. And I read, this is an interesting book. It's called Stand for the Best. It was written by Thomas Bloch. So this is the H&R Bloch family. It was about 2/3 of the way through the book. I knew that I was fortunate. I knew that by all rules of common sense, I should be content, but I wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something big and fundamental was missing. What was missing was a life outside of H&R Block or CNL for me. I was CEO and the job was consuming my life. I was making nearly $1 million a year, but I was worn out from worrying. I worried about the company, the next quarter, the next tax season. I thought about the business day and night, which made it hard to focus on my wife and our sons. My friends used to tell me I had the world by the tail, but I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. And I read that, a chair in the upstairs library of our farm, and I just started to cry. because I felt that and I hadn't ever been able to maybe articulate it. And I think, I was a basketball player in college. I played overseas. Like, I always think of games. I had Seneff on the back of my jersey every day I went into the office. I wanted to represent the family well. I wanted to represent G2 well. And the way to that, being first in, last out, never took a holiday in 15 years other than Friday or Monday, never took a week off. And that was not healthy. And it was my way of trying to be relevant, to achieve. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram for those that like the Enneagram. So that was a breaking point for me, just quickly. So just in terms of like where that went, I realized where I was as a husband, I wasn't present the way I wanted to be. Even though I really worked my calendar, I would fly home to have a bedtime and a dinner, and then I'd fly back somewhere. I wouldn't just go to the next city. I really was intentional, but I wasn't present when I was home. And so I think as a father, as a husband, as a son, as a brother, there was a lot of relational dynamics that I wasn't pleased with where I was at. So anyways, I was a half a year into a 3-year contract in the middle of 2008 when this MD Anderson experience happened. And my commitment was, I'm not going to go home and resign, but it made me say, at the end of this contract, I'm going to really think about, am I called to be in the family business, or am I doing it because the river of inertia is so powerfully taking me downstream that I'm just going to stay on that river? And so fast forward a couple of years, my contract's coming up. I got a group of friends together. I said, will you guys just hang out with me once a month on my boat dock for 6 months and just talk about this with me? And they were great, and they were very pointed, and they told me I was a bad listener and that I'd gotten a bit of an ego over the last few years, and they're like, you need to fly commercial more. They were just very direct, and they were longtime friends, and they loved me that way, and I gave them permission to hit me. And I think because of the health thing, I was open, and I wouldn't have been otherwise. Her brother said, God hit you with a 2 before, and you still barely kind of moved. Like, it took a lot for me to get off of where I was. So, quick story, I took a holiday with the family. Michelle had RV'd as a kid growing up, and we took a holiday after my contract had actually ended and I hadn't signed a new one. And we were gone for 8 days. It was great. And I remember being on the road home in the RV, and I was like, Lord, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I should do here. And it just struck me because all the kids were sleeping in the back of the RV, and we're on this really windy road. And I was like, I got to get home. I need to get home faster than this. But it was one of those red ribbon roads on the map, and it was beautiful. The sun was coming up, and there's horses, and I thought, wow, this is such a vivid symbol of, I wanted to go 100 miles an hour to get home because I had stuff to do, but everything I loved dearly was with me, and we were on a slower road, and it was beautiful, and that was okay. And so that was really an epiphany for me. So fast forward, ended up through a long period, 6-8 months, I resigned from the business. It wasn't that I had another option. It was just I felt God called me to do something different. So I left in the summer of 11, and that was hard. I remember having steak dinner with my dad, and it was hard. I was the only one in G2, as mentioned, in the business. And then we made a big decision, I think, to basically do the work we hadn't done when we were young, to say we need to create a boundary. My mom and dad were separated right around this time. But we were like, we need to create a boundary from being in Orlando, from the business, from my mom and dad. We loved my mom and dad, but we just needed space. So we decided to move. Our professor from Cambridge days was an Aussie, and he was able to get us connected. We wanted to go somewhere warm, far away, good health care, and English speaking. And so we picked Australia, and we just jumped off the cliff and said, we'll put our house up for rent. And we just went to Sydney for 6 months and lived in Chinatown, in an apartment. And we basically redid what life should be and could be at the age of 38. So that was a big restart for us. And I would say that I think 08, 9, and 10, those were all really hard years because you're digging out economically. It was a hard time. But I look back on it, and that the past had a purpose because my I'm out moment was so very clear to me, and it had built over a 3-year time frame. And a lot of that had come through just good counsel. So that helped me later to be like, that those weren't wasted years. The past did have a purpose. And then the other thing I would just mention is I think sometimes with wealth, it's easy not to have healthy feedback circles. Like, Tim, can I call you on that? And with money, sometimes that doesn't happen. And so that's something we've been real intentional with ever since our mid-30s to really make sure we have feedback loops. So those are just a couple of data points. But yeah, that's a bit more of the story. So we were in Australia for 6 months and then came back, and the 3 words I had while I was on this sabbatical, if you will, or we were away, was generosity. I always just got jazzed when we were in a meeting on philanthropy when I was in the company. Orlando, I wanted to invest in my hometown and family-owned business. I came from one. And I got a call from Todd Harper, who actually, they were starting the Central Florida Community Foundation here under NCF. And he essentially said, we need somebody to do three things. And it was essentially those three words. I've been doing that for nearly 10 years now. So that's a quick rerun of what the story's been for us, but thanks for asking.
That's great. Michelle, I'm curious if you could just unpack one or two things while you were in Australia that you guys worked on that you maybe wished you would have worked on earlier in your own family. What were some aha moments or processes when you were in Australia during that time?
Well, Australia was sort of a marker in time, definitely, for our lives as a couple and as a family. Not more than a few people have said to Tim over the years, even at that point as it happened, what are you doing? What are you thinking? You're crazy. You're throwing away this career, this wealth, all this potential. But what happened in Australia was profound. I think if I could sum it up, I experienced for the first time versus heard with my ears Tim's love for me. I began to trust him in a way that I had never before. I always imagined that I was there to serve his purposes on this journey that we were on together. But for the first time in Australia, I think I learned, no, he's actually for me beyond and aside from what I can do for him. I think that I learned when we were there that despite the adventure and the delight of living in Australia, it was wonderful, it was beautiful, it's an amazing place. We would have moved there if we could have.
Almost did.
Despite all that, I realized I was sad. I was deeply sad, even depressed. And so I think being there exposed that for me. I had no good reason to complain or be downtrodden in the mornings, and yet I was. And so I think that was the beginning of a journey for me into understanding my story and my sadness. And I think it was while I was there that I learned, so as a result of that, I began to learn that I didn't know how to be loved. And so Tim was a key part of, and continues to be a key part of that for me, that is learning to be loved and to accept love. And that was the beginning of my journey into knowing myself and my sadness and my longings for love, and yet resisting it and pushing away and preferring my loneliness. Those were some big pivotal lessons I learned while there.
Yeah, I would add two quick things there, Lonnie. Her brother had a best friend and his wife that lived in Sydney, and we didn't want to know anybody. We didn't go over there to network. And he said, you need to meet this couple. And they became our feedback loop in Sydney. Like within 3 coffees, they were just right in our grill. And they were older. And they really helped Michelle through some of this depression kind of cycle, and me on my not being present. I would be with the kids, and he's like, you're not delighting in your kids. I know you love your kids, but you're not delighting in them. You know, so we really were away, but we had that kind of direct feedback that was super helpful.
Oh, Michelle and Tim, thank you so much for sharing that part of your journey and your discovery in your own family of the greatest riches in a family and in a personal life, that sense of truly being loved and loving well in a family. There's no greater riches. So it's beautiful. I'd love to open it up to the audience for any questions that they have. I know, Gary, you've been looking at questions. I have a lot more questions I'm eager to ask you also, to some more pearls of wisdom from you guys, but I'll open it up to the audience just in case.
The question is, Tim, as a Gen 2, this family business, and we do have a lot of families that we work with where we're now engaging with Gen 2 and Gen 3, maybe even farther, deeper in their families. But what would you say is the strongest piece of advice that you would give to a Gen 2 person who's very much involved in their family business right now? From your own experience, what would that be?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's certainly some things I look back on and I would do different. I mean, I jumped right into the family business. I don't know. Maybe I should have gone and worked somewhere else first. I think that may have been beneficial. So I would say to G2s, be humble. It's easy to come in and feel like I felt that, right? I've got better ideas here. You all have been doing this. This is tired and stodgy. Like, let's be innovative. So stay humble, work hard, earn your keep. And then I would also say bridge building is a key skill, right? So you're a lot of times you're working with maybe Gen 1 and you want to honor them. And that's been a big part of our story. How do you honor G1s? And then how you also be diplomatic and create a culture of grace and truth and love. I mean, I didn't go into this, but just briefly. So my parents divorced in 2016. Nobody ever expects to have a fracture. Like, we almost had a fracture, right, in our marriage when we were having challenges and my parents did divorce. Nobody expects that. And it's like, how do you orient your life in a way to say, there will be a reset one day? I don't know what it'll be. Maybe it's the loss of a child. Maybe it's a divorce. Maybe it's a health issue. Will you be ready for that relationally? So instead of being like, well, we'll just see what happens, like, be ready for it. And I think the truth and love component in that is key, right? You want to have enough truth, get to the next step, but you also want to have love where you don't burn bridges. I tend to be a type that really wants something to be 100% done and set and nailed. And sometimes you can only go 80%, or you're going to actually damage the relationship. And so finding that truth and love balance, sometimes there's going to be a rift where you say, I'm going to actually press into peace versus conflict here on purpose, even though I don't want to, even though there are chapters maybe of the book that are completely blank and I want to go back and figure it out.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said there. And if you could share, what's a concept that you wish you would have known from the beginning of your journey working with family and business?
A concept. I think the word diplomacy is a helpful one. It's not that you don't know it, but it's an art. It takes experience, and it's just hard. It's hard to do because if you're going to corral a group of people to go do something greater than themselves, like is what a business is oriented to do, it creates a leader who's got to be humble, who has to know himself well, who has to have the truth and love balance, and who has to be diplomatic and massage things and move things, get people where you need to be. So, yeah, diplomacy and humility would probably be the two that I would think of off the top.
So based on what you know now, if you were able to rewind the clock several years and have a do-over, so to speak, using the wisdom that you've gained from your actual experience, but going back in time, what are some things that you guys might do differently?
Well, I think we mentioned it. One of the dynamics for sure is we did not know thyself, right? The Socrates line, like we didn't know ourselves very well. We hadn't done much work on ourselves, and we didn't do a lot of work in our marriage relationally and really going deep young. And the go-go years really kind of put us off course. So doing the deep work of knowing who you are, who you're not, that's a huge one, right? I mean, our 19-year-old is in college as a freshman, Michelle mentioned, and it's like, I'm glad he's going to have a degree and it's a great school, all that. But at the end of the 4 years, you really hope that he's starting to know who he is, because that is the basis for which you build purpose and all these other things out of fulfilling life. So I would have dug in more on that for sure. I think one thing I realized in the fracture we had in our family with the divorce, we started doing family meetings in 06 and 07. And then 08 happened with the crisis. So 8 and 9, we didn't do meetings. And then there was relational stuff going on. So then we just had our first family meeting in January since 2007. So you can see how the lack of a cadence of communication is just so key. Building up trust, building up that relational bank. It's almost as if you were to think about it like a bank. When a crisis comes, it's going to come. What's in the relational bank account? What's the trust in that bank account? Because if it's low, it's going to be ugly. Whereas if there's a high level of trust and relationship, then you can get through it, especially if you communicate and there's a cadence and a rhythm of meeting together and doing life together. I mean, you've heard the cliche, families that play together stay together. That's kind of goofy, but it's true. And so the more you can be relationally dialed in, that's why the work that Michelle does with her kids, staying up till 1 a.m. when they want to talk in bed, like, that's valuable. Or me playing ping pong with my daughter last night when I didn't have time, but she wants to play a best of 25 ping pong series over the next 4 months, partly because she's down big. But, you know, it's just, that's a big part of the game, is trying to figure out how to relationally invest.
Tim, I'm going to throw in a question that came from Lonnie's wife, Shelley. The mom is wanting to know something from, I think really from both of you guys, maybe as much from Michelle, but the question is, how do you practically delight in your kids?
Oh, man.
You're good at it.
I mean, I'm honored that Shelley would ask that question. I have a feeling she has a pretty good answer herself. I just think my kids are great. So it's not really hard. I think my boys are hilarious. I think my girls, are spectacularly creative. So I think I just choose to focus on what I'm amazed by in them. There's certainly plenty, we have a couple middle school daughters. There's plenty of drama that we could get bogged down with, but I think I just choose to enjoy the good. Another example would be that our son Wesley is notoriously unavailable. He's not in your presence. You don't know anything about him. And so I think the flip side of that I've tried to remind ourselves is we don't want him attached to his phone. That's kind of a gift. I love that about him, that he is where he is at all times, even if that's a little bit irritating sometimes. So just to enjoy, I just enjoy them. I have an inflated view of how wonderful they are.
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. For me, focusing on the whole person, I think being an athlete, it's sometimes easy to skew orientation towards, I think we have one playing in college, another one about to play in college. Like, all right, your athletic kind of world is, but mental, physical, spiritual, relational, like how do we develop whole persons? And the other thing that's helped me is thinking through, like, there's a phase for being a cop, there's a phase for being a coach, and a phase for being a consultant, and you have to wear the right hat. So Brock is a freshman. We're in consultant mode with him. We're in coach mode with Wes and Rachel, but we're more in cop mode with our 8 or 9-year-old. It's just different. And so how do you make sure you're doing that? And then also just creating a multi-gen mindset with them through storytelling, through talking about core values. We did our core values a few years ago as a family, that they're part of something bigger. That's been helpful. And I also think the other thing I would say that with this relational challenge we had as a family a few years ago, I think one of the things we really wanted to do is to figure out a way to honor our parents. It's the only command in the Bible connected to a promise, right? You'll have long life. Honor your mom and dad. And it's the hard. I think it has a promise because it's the hardest. It's really hard. And I love my mom and dad, but it's really hard sometimes to honor them in certain things. So we wanted to honor them through that challenge and also model us honoring them to our children. Because you know what? We're not going to do it right. And in the future, I want them to honor us even when we screw up or make a mistake. And so that was something we were really intentional about in terms of loving on the kids and their development.
Thanks for that. What you just said kind of ties in with another question that came up, I think, goes beyond just your immediate family with your kids, but with your siblings. You mentioned, Tim, you're the oldest of 5, I think you said. And how did the divorce of your parents affect your relationships with your siblings?
Well, nobody wins with a divorce, right? I mean, that line is out there, and that's true. I think it's easy to maybe think as an adult, I was in my 40s and my youngest brother was in his 20s. Oh, we're adults, we're married, like a divorce isn't going to impact us. And that's really crazy talk, right? It does impact you. It impacts you, your spouse, your kids. And so it was hard, right? Because we're trying to love mom and dad well. And yet at the same time, we probably all had maybe some different thoughts on it. And partly we're spread out all over the country, right? But I would say that by us talking things through and pursuing peace versus conflict, the more recent years has been sweet. I mean, honestly, during COVID, 2 of my West Coast siblings, they haven't been to Florida much, and they were here for months at a time, right? Because this was an open state. So that was really cool. I didn't expect going into COVID. That was a silver lining. We got to hang out a lot with my sibs that I don't normally get to see as much. So it was challenging. I would say there's real value in counseling. I think there can be a stigma around that. We're big fans of it. Like, we're doing it right now, and it's not crisis mode. It's just being healthy, having a third party. And so we did have a counselor that we were given this counselor's information when we were going through some tough sledding, and each of the 5 of us had access to this person. They're actually out on the West Coast. And Michelle and I remember, we were going to a cocktail party one time, and we're like, oh, you know what? I think my dad's going to be there with this woman he's dating. And what do we do? So we called this person on the phone, and it was just great advice. So I think having a cadence of going to counseling, recognizing there can be some real wisdom in that, figuring out how to be neighborly and loving and all of that, and thinking about what grace do I want my kids and others to bestow on me when I'm older? How do I do that now? That's been a filter.
Thank you. This has gone by so quickly, and we've got so many other questions that we could ask and more conversation, but I want to honor our commitment to this being a 45-minute webinar. And we did offer that guests would remain on for another 15 minutes. So those of you who need to leave, we want to give you the opportunity to just drop off now if you wish. But if you want to stay with us for another 15 minutes, we'll continue with a few more of the questions that we haven't answered. So thank you for joining us, those of you who do have to leave. And keep watching our emails. We try to send out every 2 to 3 weeks an email just updating you on what's happening with Family Meridian, upcoming webinars. And we hope to get back to some live events sometime soon. The board's been talking about that. So again, keep in touch through our emails that we send out. So Lonnie, I'm going to go back to you for another question. Why don't you throw one out for Tim and Michelle?
Thank you, Gary. I do have many more questions. I love getting the wisdom from you guys. So I'm curious what you've learned along the way that is actually helping you find greater meaning and joy in your lives and in your family right now. What are some things that you've learned that are really serving you well now and maybe causing you to do things differently in your own family?
We have thought about this question before. I would say there's 4 or 5 things that come to mind. One, within our marriage, we see movement from being bound up and tethered to our families of origin toward an untethered state where the two of us function as a unit, loving our families of origin, but prioritizing one another and our family unit. And that certainly gets complicated, all the more complicated when there's wealth involved. True colors start to show when there's wealth and trusts and inheritances. And so I think it's been a really good exercise to examine our hearts, be confident that this is our priority. You want to add something?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Sure.
We have, I think over the course of our marriage, we've moved from a position of predictable and controlled, where our life circumstances are very much not orchestrated, but within our control, to a position of riskiness and adventure taking, both vocationally for Tim, generosity wise, like we've started to begin to imagine our finances in a sort of upside down fashion, where rather than keeping track of how much we're earning, we're keeping track of how much we're giving and being delighted more. The thrill and the risk of giving has become a new way of sort of measuring our success, if you will. We see an effort in our marriage away from striving, effort, desperation, whether it was for Tim at work to try to earn recognition and credibility, or for me as a parent to sort of the struggle to raise up successful children, away from that model toward rest and safety with each other, rest with an understanding of who we are in Christ, that our identity is already solid, so we don't need to strive. And I would say, finally, the trajectory of our lives has been one of seeking life that is truly life, longing to find meaning and hope. I mean, it's been a real tangible journey spiritually to ask ourselves the questions like, what am I convicted of? What is the truth that I believe? Not the truth that my family believed, but the one that I embrace personally and as a couple, and being able to articulate my hope, my personal hope, I think, in a longing for life that is truly life.
And then I might take that. And then the last one is just, I think, for me, being on a trajectory, if we're looking at 4 or 5 big themes in the last 6 or 8 years, of my manhood being connected to my pursuit of Michelle and family and her heart versus identity and work and being an achiever. So that's been a shift. I'm still really bad at it, but I'm working at it. So those would be some maybe large level kind of thematics that we're tilting towards, or at least achieving or attempting to tilt towards.
Lonnie, if I could, I'm going to pick up on one of the questions that came from one of our participants in the webinar. Jamie was asking a question, and I know that, Tim, in the work that you do, you're facing this not only from your own experience, but with many of the families that you work with as well. And it's that question of how do you deal with failure that is going to come at some point or in time or another, whether it's personally or with your business. And how do you help your kids be encouraged to see failure as growth as opposed to getting insulated from it because of the wealth? And how does that play into an estate plan, pushing wealth downstream? That's one of the big things that we talk about, the failures of this 90-10 rule. What do you think about some of those aspects of that question?
Well, one thing I would say just to start off that answer is, I think if you're fuzzy on what you want to do with inheritance with kiddos, you're really fuzzy on your generosity kind of / giving strategy. And so those go together. And so for us, as we're thinking about our children and failure, it's like, how do we start to inculcate this idea that we love you and we are invested in you? And if you get a bad grade or you have a bad game or this venture goes south, our connection and love is connected to you as a person, not your performance. And I'm a performer and an achiever, so I have to really work at that. But I think that's one thing we're trying to think through. And so as we think about how we may pass things on to our kiddos, we've historically thought we're not going to give them anything. We're just going to give it all away. But ironically, as we've started to think this through, like if we're doing our jobs right, they would be better stewards of resources than we would if we're doing it right. And so then maybe they would. So then we want to enter in this idea of risk that Michelle mentioned, that if you are in your calling and you're pursuing something and you're working hard and it fails, that's okay. So we do a lot of skunk works, and we really encourage our kids to work. My son Brock was in a wetsuit cleaning out lakefronts last summer, and this summer he's going to work at inner city school in Chicago. Like, just go try stuff and see what you like. Sometimes it'll be great, sometimes it won't be great, and see what happens. So I think failure, if that's an option, that's really healthy. And we're trying to do the best we can on instilling that.
Do you both feel there's value to an intergenerational family business? That's first part of the question. Is there value to an intergenerational family business? And then if so, how would you counsel a family in doing this well?
That's a great question. Well, if you look throughout, I was a history major undergrad, and you look throughout history and it's just baked in the literature, it's baked in scriptures. I mean, it's just everywhere. Just look at what the annual GDP is off of family-owned businesses in America or around the world now. So it is just part of how we do things, right? I grew up going in the mailroom at CNL. I was a part of the business. I didn't even think about it. I was just part of it. You see a lot of these professional athletes, their kids are professional athletes. I mean, they just swam in that water. They breathe that air. So I think it's a natural human thing to float towards. But I do think communication is a huge component. I think making sure Gen 2s and Gen 3s feel like they can pursue their own calling and they're free to pursue that is really key, because if they feel pressure to come into the family business, then the motives aren't right. And then on top of that, incentives can get misaligned, right? Like if job A pays $100 and the family business pays $500, it makes it kind of hard for kids to decide without the money being part of that equation. So I think that's key. The other thing Lonnie and I were talking about in the prep yesterday, I think it's very easy for G1s or G2s, for that matter, for younger generations to promote up quickly. And that's partly, I don't want to say that could be a pride of the older generation or even the younger generation that they're ready. But I think when in doubt, go slower. I mean, I was president at 32. I was too young. I look back at it now and it was just, I was hardworking. I had a lot of things I think I did well, but there's a lot of things that I just was not refined on. I had sharp elbows on certain issues. I just needed more refinement, more coaching. So I think that's important, not to push people into the business, number one, and or push them into the business, into leadership roles too fast, because I think that can be hurtful, right, to the ongoing nature. And I also think if there's a broader, bigger picture we really want this business to stay around for a couple hundred years and really paint that and storytell and convene and communicate. There is a way to do it. And it can be really sweet and awesome, but it's hard. I met with 3 brothers the other day. They're all in their early 60s to late 60s. This was an NCF meeting. And they love each other. And they meet every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 hours for lunch. And I'm sure they've had their stuff. But I walked out of that and I just got emotional because I was like, that is just the coolest thing. 3 brothers, their dad has passed away, and they just love being together, and they work together, and they love each other, and they respect one another. And that was beautiful, right? So I think it's something to aspire towards, but it's hard.
And I think it starts, my only 2 cents would be, it starts when they're little. And I think it starts when they're at home. I feel like when you're engaging a relationship, because relationship, if we have one thing to say, is the relationship trumps all. And so in this case, it would be the same motto. Because when you're in relationship with one another and you are honest and loving toward one another, then you can accomplish anything, whether it's not working in the family business or working in the family business, both of which can be complicated.
Yeah. So, sorry, one thing, I know we're running out of time, but this kiss the ring idea is real, right? So my to-be 15-year-old, she's a great volleyball player. And the other day, she said something to me, hey, Dad, you really think I could play college volleyball? And when I got underneath it, I played college sport, Brock plays college sport, Wes is getting recruited to play college sport. I think she feels it's like the family business, like she needs to do that or she's not going to be up to snuff. And I had to release her from that, just to say that is not something you have to pursue. If it's something you want to do, great, you can pursue it. But this, I think for her, like, I want Dad to think I'm cool and I want his blessing. And so you think about that in the family business context, you want to kiss the ring in some ways because you want to be honoring. But at the other side is kissing the ring can be really unhealthy. And like I said, the alignment and the incentives can get messed up. So that's a dynamic, right? How do we allow our kids to really have true freedom in pursuing their calling? If they want to do something like architecture or be an artist and you know it's not going to pay, the answer is not, you know what, that sounds great, but you're never going to make any money doing it. Like, we have to reorient that to say, how could I, in my platform, with our marriage, with our connections, enable her to flourish in that, right? That's the orientation. And it's hard because you want your kids to all do really well and make a bunch of money, and yet that may not be what they're called to do.
Tim and Michelle, great answer. How to foster a culture in the family where each generation builds on the values and the benefits of the prior generation, and at the same time feels completely empowered to craft their own destiny that they feel called to pursue. Not an easy balance, but thanks for the great wisdom on that. So we're just about out of time. I just have one more question for you guys. From all the wisdom that you've gained from your journey in family business and leading your own family, what's one parting piece of advice that you'd give to family members who really are wanting to be intentional about creating a healthier, multi-generational family legacy? What would be bubbled to the top of your list as like your parting piece of advice?
Go ahead. I'm going to let Michelle go, and then I have one. Go ahead, Dave.
I would say, sort of as we've brought up multiple times, instilling the top priority within the family of relationship. The value of the person far outweighs the value of whatever success might be. Tim's mom in the family meeting that he mentioned gathered us, his 5 siblings and spouses, and her gathered to discuss a family trust and how to do financial matters. But she was very clear that the relationships far outweigh the financial value of what we were doing around this table. And if at any point the wealth begins to damage the relationships, we will do away with this trust tomorrow if it means that these relationships can stay intact. So I think that would be my one, if I could hang my hat on one idea, it would be the person is far more important than the success. And we try to teach that to our children now. Like, if you're talking ugly to your sibling, what are you accomplishing? If you're actually, maybe you're getting what you want, but you're damaging the person. And so you've actually lost in that transaction.
Yeah, I'll add one quickly, and I know we're on the hour. So to build off that, relational health is the foundation of everything else, right? So governance, estate planning, generosity plan. You can have all the advisors in the world and all the plans in the world, purpose, vision, mission. It doesn't matter. If mom and dad aren't relationally healthy and mom and dad aren't relationally healthy with their kiddos and then the spouses that marry in, none of that other stuff matters. And it's really hard work, right? And that's the soft issues of the family. So that is foundational. And are you prepared for a reset? It could happen to you. And do you have relational capital in the bank to withstand it? And are you building in rhythms in a weekly, daily way to build up that capital? So those would just be a couple parting thoughts. Very thankful for the opportunity to be with you today.
Beautiful. Tim and Michelle, thank you so much for your transparency and sharing your story with us. I really treasure the pure gems of wisdom that you shared so genuinely and generously with us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you
Grateful.
both.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Systems for Success, where the mystery of success is solved in the magic of the system. To ask us questions you'd like us to address in future episodes, go to systemsforsuccess.com. See you next time.